Between 1910 and 1970, about 6 million black families moved north, but most of them packed the same breakfast habits they had carried out of the South. The grandmothers who ran those kitchens before sunrise worked from one rule: nothing on the morning table cost more than a few cents. Number 24 on this list turned a single piece of fatback into breakfast for a whole week. Number 16 was the cheapest thing a sharecropper's wife could put on a plate. Number 8 on this list shows up in almost every soul food memoir from the 1960s. Here's the paradox. The poorest breakfasts often fed people longer and stronger than anything the grocery stores uptown sold. Hit subscribe before this list ends. Here are 25 cheap 1960s soul food breakfasts for black seniors on a budget. Number 25, fried cornmeal mush with cane syrup. For most black families in 1960, the morning started with a pot of yesterday's mush sliced into squares. The rule was simple: cook a heavy pot of cornmeal on Sunday night, pour it into a loaf pan, and let it sit in the icebox until it was firm enough to slice. By Monday morning, a 1/4-inch slab hit the hot grease and crisped up dark brown on both sides. A spoon of cane syrup or molasses went over the top, and that was breakfast for a working man or a school child. Cornmeal sold for about 18 cents for a 5-pound sack in 1960, which meant a family could eat from that one bag for almost 2 weeks. Nothing got thrown away. The crumbs that fell off the cutting board went into the chicken bucket on the back porch. Number 24, 1 slab of fatback, 7 mornings. A single piece of fatback could feed a whole household for a week, and grandmothers in Mississippi and Alabama knew exactly how to make it last. They would buy 1 thick slab on Saturday for around 20 cents a pound, then score it across the top with a paring knife so the salt would render down slow. Monday morning, 2 slices went into the cold skillet. Those slices crisped up and gave back nearly a cup of clear, golden grease that flavored everything else that hit the pan that week. The skillet never got washed. The leftover grease became the cooking fat for Tuesday's eggs, Wednesday's grits, Thursday's potatoes, and Friday's Hoecakes. By Sunday, the original slab was almost gone, but the flavor had touched every plate that came through the kitchen. 1 pig and a careful hand could carry a family from one paycheck to the next, and almost no one threw away the brown bits stuck to the bottom of the pan. Number 23, hot water cornbread for breakfast. When the flour ran out before payday, a quick patty of hot water cornbread filled the gap, and almost every soul food kitchen leaned on this trick. The method had only 3 things in it: cornmeal, a little salt, and boiling water poured straight from the kettle. The mix went stiff in the bowl, then a wet hand patted it into rounds the size of a saucer, and those rounds dropped into a 1/4 inch of hot lard. 3 minutes aside and breakfast was on the table. Working women in Detroit and Cleveland kept a coffee can of cornmeal next to the stove for exactly this reason. It cost almost nothing, it filled up a grown man, and it took less than 10 minutes from start to finish. The patties were often eaten torn open with a spoonful of Potlikker saved from the night before. Number 22, sunrise skillet grits with pan drippings. The sunrise kitchen in a 1960s soul food household ran on one rhythm, and grits with pan drippings was its first sound. Water went into the heavy pot before anyone else was awake. Once it rolled, a slow handful of stone, ground white grits got stirred in with a long wooden spoon, and the pot sat at the back of the stove for almost an hour. Right before plating, a tablespoon of bacon drippings from the coffee can on the counter went straight into the bowl. That spoonful turned a plain breakfast into something that tasted like the meat from the night before, without costing 1 extra cent. The bowl came to the table with the rim of the spoon already buried, and most people did not look up until the bowl was clean. That spoonful of saved drippings is what we still call the soul of soul food, one quiet ingredient carrying the memory of every meal that came before it. Number 21, salt pork gravy, overday old biscuits. No biscuit was ever thrown out in a black household in 1960 because a tough biscuit became the foundation for the cheapest gravy on the planet. 2 small cubes of salt pork rendered in a skillet until the bottom was coated in golden fat. A heaping spoon of flour stirred into the grease-brown slow, and then a cup of evaporated milk thinned with water got whisked in until the gravy was thick enough to coat the back of a spoon. The yesterday biscuits, hard and a little stale, got split open and laid in the bowl, and the gravy poured over them softened them right back to fresh. Working families in Memphis and Birmingham ate this twice a week through the winter months. It used what was already in the kitchen. It cost about a dime in ingredients, and it sat heavy enough to last a full morning of work. The plate went out the door warm, and the bowl came back empty by the second swallow. Number 20, sweet potato pancakes with sorghum. Leftover sweet potatoes from Sunday dinner almost always ended up on Tuesday's griddle, smashed into pancakes thick with sorghum syrup. The potatoes from Sunday got mashed cold with a fork, then mixed with a half cup of flour, 1 egg, and just enough buttermilk to loosen the batter. A small ladle poured the mix onto a hot, greased griddle, and the cakes came up orange-brown with crisp, lacy edges. The sorghum bottle sat on the table because it cost less than maple syrup and held more flavor in 1 spoon. Black families across the South kept a jug of sorghum on the shelf year-round, since 1 gallon could last from October planting to April plowing. The pancakes filled up a child fast, used food that would have gone bad by Wednesday, and tasted like dessert in the middle of a hard week. Number 19, smothered onions on toast. When there was no meat at all, a skillet of slow smothered onions over day-old bread was breakfast. 2 large yellow onions went into the pan with a spoon of saved drippings, and the heat stayed low for almost 20 minutes. The onions cooked down to a soft brown jam that smelled like supper instead of sacrifice. 2 slices of bread, toasted dry in the oven, got covered with the warm onions and eaten with a fork. It was the kind of breakfast nobody bragged about, but it kept the body going on a morning when the icebox was almost empty. Number 18, Streako lean and red-eye gravy. Few breakfasts spoke louder about Black Southern survival than a thin slice of Streako lean with a pour of red-eye gravy on top. Streako lean was the cheap cousin of bacon, a piece of side meat with stripes of pink running through the fat. It cost half what bacon cost. In 1965, sometimes only 15 cents a pound at a country store. 2 slices went into a hot pan and curled up tight as they crisped, leaving a thin layer of brown drippings stuck to the bottom. A half cup of strong black coffee poured straight into that hot pan, and the brown bits lifted off the iron in seconds. That dark, salty pour was the red-eye gravy. It went over a split biscuit or a wedge of cornbread, and the streak of lean sat right on top. The flavor was bigger than the price, and most older folks today still remember the smell of coffee hitting that pan first thing in the morning. For many of us, that 1 pour of red-eye gravy is the closest thing our grandmothers ever left behind to a written recipe. Number 17, Hoecakes cooked on the stove lid. The oldest breakfast in the soul food canon was a flat round of cornmeal cooked right on the hot iron, and it was still on tables in 1965. A cup of stone ground cornmeal, a little salt, and boiling water were the only ingredients. The dough patted out flat between 2 palms, then went straight onto a greased lid or the back of a heavy iron griddle. 3 or 4 minutes aside and the edges were crisp, the middle still tender. Working families ate them split with a smear of lard and a drizzle of cane syrup, and field hands carried the extras wrapped in a piece of newspaper to eat at mid-morning break. Hoecakes trace back centuries in Black cooking, and almost every grandmother in the rural South still made them at least once a week. Number 16, mush and molasses. The cheapest thing a sharecropper's wife could put on a plate in 1962 was a bowl of hot cornmeal mush with a spoon of dark molasses cut through the middle. The math told the whole story. Cornmeal at 18 cents for 5 pounds, molasses at 50 cents a quart, and 1 pot of water from the well. That bowl of breakfast worked out to less than 2 cents per serving, and it filled up a grown man until dinner. The mush got stirred slow for 15 minutes so it stayed smooth, then poured into a wide bowl while still steaming. The molasses sank down to the bottom in dark ribbons, and the spoon caught a little of both with every bite. Tenant farming families across Arkansas and Mississippi ate this 6 mornings a week for most of the decade. It was the food of people who counted every coin, but the warmth of it kept whole households going through the coldest months of the year. Number 15, Souse meat on saltine crackers. Souse, also called hog head cheese, was the breakfast meat of working people who could not afford bacon. A hog's head got simmered for hours with vinegar, peppers, and salt. Then the cooked meat was packed tight into a loaf pan and chilled until it sliced like jelly. 2 cold slices on a stack of saltine crackers made a breakfast that was salty, tangy, and filling enough for a morning shift. A small loaf cost about 35 cents in a Black neighborhood grocery, and it lasted 4 to 5 mornings if the family was careful with the slicing. Number 14, scrambled eggs stretched with flour. When a dozen eggs cost 57 cents and a household had 6 mouths to feed, you stretched the eggs with flour and nobody complained. 2 eggs got beaten in a bowl with a heaping tablespoon of flour and a splash of water until smooth. That mixture poured into a hot grease pan made enough fluffy curds to feed 3 children. The flour added body, the eggs added flavor, and the pan came out almost as full as if 4 eggs had gone in. Working mothers across the urban South used this trick on Wednesdays and Thursdays when payday was still 2 mornings away. Older folks today remember it as a perfectly normal breakfast and never once thought of it as cutting corners. It was simply how breakfast got made. What we now romanticize as soul food started right here at the kitchen counter with a tablespoon of flour stretching what our mothers had into what the household needed. Number 13, hog jowl with black coffee. A single thin slice of smoked hog jowl with a cup of strong black coffee was the breakfast of men who had to be at the mill or the field by sunrise. The jowl came from the cheek of the pig and cost almost nothing because most white grocery stores did not want it. In a soul food household, it was treasured. 1 slice in a hot pan rendered into smoky brown grease and curled up crisp at the edges. The coffee, boiled in a battered enamel pot and poured strong enough to stand a spoon in, washed it down. There was no toast, no eggs, no fuss. Just meat, fat, and heat in the belly with the smell of wood smoke still in the cured pork. Black families in the Carolinas and Tennessee mountain country ate this 6 days a week through the winter, and grandmothers swore it was what kept the men working past sundown without sitting down once. Number 12, liver mush, slices with hot coffee. Liver mush was the cheap North Carolina cousin of scrapple, and in Black households across the Piedmont, it carried the cold months from October through to March. The loaf came wrapped in waxy butcher paper for about 30 cents a pound in 1963, less than half the price of any cured pork on the same counter. It was ground pork liver mixed with stone ground cornmeal, dried sage, and plenty of black pepper. then chilled solid in a loaf pan overnight until it cut clean. 2 cold slices hit a dry pan first thing in the morning and crisped up dark brown on both sides in under 5 minutes. No extra grease needed. A thick slice on a piece of light bread with a smear of yellow mustard fed a grown man straight through to his lunch break, and the mug of strong black coffee beside it finished the meal off. Number 11, tomato gravy over buttermilk biscuits. Nothing on a 1960s black Southern breakfast table held more memory in one bowl than tomato gravy ladled hot over a split buttermilk biscuit. The numbers behind this dish tell the story of how soul food kitchens stretched a Saturday market trip across an entire week of mornings. 1 quart jar of home canned tomatoes cost about 12 cents to put up in the summer if you grew the tomatoes yourself, and 1 quart could gravy 3 full mornings of biscuits for a family of 5. Buttermilk ran 24 cents a quart at the corner store, and a 5-pound sack of self-rising flour ran 59 cents. Total cost per breakfast, about 8 cents a head. That was nearly a third of what a plate of bacon and eggs cost at the lunch counter on the same block. The method had a rhythm that almost every black grandmother in Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia knew by feel. 2 tablespoons of bacon drippings melted slow in a heavy pan. 2 tablespoons of flour stirred in until the roux turned the color of peanut butter. Then the home canned tomatoes went in with their juice, a hard pinch of sugar, plenty of black pepper, and a half cup of evaporated milk swirled through at the very end. The gravy turned from rusty red to a soft pink, thick enough to coat the back of a wooden spoon. The biscuits came out of the oven golden, got split open with a fork, and the gravy poured over the cut sides until it ran down onto the plate. According to oral history projects collected at HBCU libraries through the 70s and 80s, more than 70% of black families surveyed in the rural South named biscuits and gravy as their most remembered childhood breakfast. The tomato version was almost always the one they meant, and almost no one ever forgot the smell of it on a cold school morning. Number 10, smoked herring and salt and crackers. Smoked herring was the cheapest fish a black household could buy in 1964, and a small wooden box of it could feed breakfast to 4 people for under a quarter. The whole salted herring came packed dry, stiff as a piece of leather, with the skin still on and the eyes still in. They had to soak in cold water overnight to pull the worst of the salt out, and most grandmothers changed the water at least once before bed. By morning, the fish had softened enough to pull apart easily with a fork. The flakes got piled onto a stack of saltine crackers, sometimes with a thin slice of raw yellow onion on top, sometimes with a single drop of hot sauce, and that was breakfast on a Tuesday or a Thursday. The flavor was sharp, smoky, and unforgettable, and the herring tradition traced straight back through the Great Migration to the coastal South, where black families had been salting and smoking fish for generations long before anyone called it soul food. The smoked herring on our grandmothers' tables in 1964 was the same fish their grandmothers had pulled from low country waters 100 years earlier, and the recipe never needed writing down. Number 9, chicken livers and onions on toast. A paper tub of chicken livers cost almost nothing at the butcher counter, and a black grandmother could turn it into a hot breakfast that tasted like restaurant food on a Saturday. A half-pound ran about 18 cents in 1962 because most white grocery customers walked right past the livers and headed for the breast meat. The livers got rinsed cold, patted dry, then dredged in seasoned flour heavy with salt, black pepper, and a shake of paprika. They dropped into a hot pan of bacon drippings alongside a thick sliced yellow onion. 6 minutes later, the livers were dark brown outside and just pink in the middle, and the onions had collapsed into a deep dark gravy at the bottom of the pan. 2 slices of toasted day-old bread went on the plate, the livers spooned over the top with all the pan juices. Number 8, salmon croquettes with hot grits. No single breakfast shows up in more 1960s soul food memoirs than a plate of crisp salmon croquettes alongside a bowl of stone ground grits. The whole meal started with a 15-ounce can of pink salmon, which cost 49 cents at a neighborhood grocery in 1965 and went a long way. The fish came out of the can with the bones still in, and black grandmothers in Detroit, Chicago, and Birmingham crushed those soft bones right into the mix for the calcium. The salmon got mashed with a beaten egg, a half cup of yellow cornmeal, a chopped onion, and a little of the juice from the can to hold everything together. Patted into flat rounds and dropped into hot grease, the croquettes turned deep golden in about 3 minutes a side. A bowl of grits went on the plate next to them, and a spoon of bacon drippings melted down through the grits. The whole plate cost less than 30 cents to put together. Number 7, fried bologna with cane syrup. A thick-cut slice of bologna, fried until the edges curled into a cup, then drizzled with cane syrup, was the breakfast of black children all across the urban South in the 1960s. The trick was the cut at the edge. 2 small slits cut into the rim of each slice kept it from puffing up in the middle so it crisped flat in the hot grease. A quarter pound of bologna ran about 15 cents at the corner store, enough for 4 hungry kids. The slices fried in their own fat, no extra grease needed, and came out shiny dark brown with crisp, lacy edges. The syrup hit the hot meat and turned into a thin glaze that ran down onto the plate. Most working mothers in Houston, New Orleans, and Jacksonville sent kids out the door with this breakfast at least once a week. It was hot, it was sweet, it was salty, and it lasted them through the morning at school without a single complaint about the cost. Number 6, pan-fried potatoes with onion. A quarter-inch slice of cold leftover boiled potatoes dropped into a hot pan with a chopped onion and a heaping spoon of saved bacon drippings was a Wednesday morning breakfast in almost every black kitchen across the urban South in the 1960s. The potatoes from Sunday dinner sat in the icebox for 2 days waiting for exactly this use, because nothing in that household ever went to waste. They went into the hot pan flat, side down, and got pressed with the back of a spatula until the bottom side was crisp and dark brown, almost burnt at the corners. The onion went in halfway through cooking and caramelized into the edges of the pan, picking up every speck of starch the potatoes left behind. A hard pinch of salt, plenty of black pepper, and breakfast was on the table in 12 minutes flat for under 5 cents a plate. The crisp brown edge on those potatoes is the part we still chase in our own kitchens today, even when the icebox is full and nothing is left over from Sunday. Number 5, country ham with black coffee. A single paper thin slice of country ham, salt cured and aged for months in a smokehouse, was the Sunday morning breakfast that black families saved for after church. The ham came whole from a country market for about $1.20 a pound in 1964, but one ham fed the household for nearly a month if it was sliced thin enough. The slice went into a dry pan over medium heat and curled tight as it cooked, the salt crystals melting into the fat at the edges. 2 minutes aside and the ham was done, deep mahogany at the edges, soft pink in the middle, and so salty that one slice flavored a whole mouthful of biscuit. The cup of strong black coffee at its side did the rest of the work. Country ham this way traced back to the smokehouse traditions black families had carried out of Virginia and the Carolinas during the Great Migration, and the smell of it on a Sunday morning told the whole block that somebody had stretched their grocery money one more week. Number 4, buttermilk biscuits split with sorghum. A hot buttermilk biscuit, split open and drizzled heavy with dark sorghum syrup, was the breakfast nobody ever got tired of, no matter how many mornings in a row it came around. 3 cups of self-rising flour, a half cup of cold lard cut in with 2 knives, and a cup of cold buttermilk poured in last made 12 fat biscuits for under 20 cents in 1963. The dough got patted out by hand and cut with the rim of a tin can if the family did not own a biscuit cutter. The biscuits went into a hot oven for 10 minutes and came out tall, golden, and steaming, and the sorghum jug came down off the high shelf. The amber syrup pooled in the soft middle, and one biscuit kept the child going until the lunch bell rang at school. Number 3, sardines on saltine crackers. A flat tin of sardines, peeled open with the little key at the corner, was the breakfast of black working men who had to be out the door before sunrise on a Monday. The oil-packed tin cost about a dime in 1965 and held enough small fish to top 15 saltine crackers. The trick was a few drops of hot sauce shaken onto each fish, then a slice of yellow onion laid on top and the cracker eaten in 2 bites. The whole meal happened standing up at the kitchen counter while the coffee finished boiling on the back of the stove. Black longshoremen in Mobile and Baltimore packed an unopened tin and a sleeve of crackers in a lunch pail for the late morning hunger that always came around 10. Cheap, salty, protein heavy, and ready to eat without lighting a single burner, sardines were the breakfast that survived shift work, lean weeks, and every grocery store strike of the decade. The tin our grandfathers carried in a coat pocket is the same blue and yellow tin many of us still recognize on the shelf today, unchanged since the morning they peeled it open at the kitchen counter. Number 2, homemade sausage patties from pork scraps. When the butcher had a Saturday sale on pork shoulder trimmings for 10 cents a pound, a black grandmother bought 4 pounds at once and turned it into a month of breakfast sausage. The scraps got ground at home with a hand-crank grinder bolted right to the edge of the kitchen table, the children taking turns at the handle. Salt, black pepper, dried sage from the back porch jar, a hard pinch of cayenne, and a spoon of brown sugar went into the mixing bowl with the ground meat. The seasoned mix got patted into small, flat rounds by hand, stacked between sheets of waxed paper, and stored in the icebox. 3 patties hit a hot pan first thing, rendered out their own grease, and were ready in 7 minutes flat. The smell of that homemade sage sausage on a cold morning told everyone in the house that breakfast was hot. Number 1, the Sunday country breakfast spread. Nothing on a 1960s soul food table carried more weight than the full Sunday country breakfast spread laid out before church. The whole table came together at sunrise. A pan of buttermilk biscuits, a bowl of stone ground grits with a spoon of butter melting on top, a plate of streaker lean, a small pile of pan-fried potatoes, scrambled eggs, stretched soft, a saucer of tomato gravy, and a pot of strong coffee at the center. Every dish on it had been on the morning table at some other point in the week, but on Sunday, they all came out together. The cost still ran under $1.50 for a family of 6, but the meaning of it was bigger than the price. Sunday breakfast was the one morning of the week when nobody ate standing up, nobody ate on the porch, and nobody left the table until the last biscuit was gone. Number 21, sawmill gravy and biscuits. The name came from lumber camps, where cooks fed crews for pennies. You rendered salt pork in a skillet, stirred flour into the drippings until golden, then poured in milk and scraped the bottom until it thickened into a pale, peppery gravy. Pour that over a split biscuit, and you had breakfast that stuck to your ribs until supper. In black households across the rural South, sawmill gravy was the breakfast that appeared when there was not any meat for the plate. The gravy was the meat course, flavored with drippings that gave it a richness disguising how little pork was involved. Grandmothers had been making biscuits by feel for decades, cutting lard into flour with their fingers, adding buttermilk until the dough felt right. Biscuits in 12 minutes, gravy in 8, a full breakfast for 5 people, less than 30 cents. Corn pone was not cornbread. No eggs, no leavening, no buttermilk, just cornmeal, water, and salt pressed into thick rounds and baked on the skillet until the outside formed a thin, crisp crust and the inside stayed dense in the way only water and cornmeal can. The technique came directly from enslaved communities where ash cakes and pone were the most fundamental corn preparations. What Dr. Martha Barrenda, director of the Blanchard House Museum of African History and Culture in Punta Gorda, Florida, identified as rooted in the West African relationship with grain, carried intact through every generation that followed emancipation. In the mornings, you reheated a piece from the day before in the same skillet where the fatback had fried, so the pone soaked up the drippings and developed a brown, greasy, savory bottom crust. You broke it into a bowl and poured warm, rendered fatback drippings over the top, a loose, clear gravy that wasted nothing from the morning's frying, dense enough to hold you through hours of labor. It asked nothing except the willingness to use what was already in the pan. Number 22, buttermilk biscuits with cane syrup. In the 1950s, a lager cane syrup was a staple on black breakfast tables across the South. Women in Mobile, Alabama, would pull a pan of biscuits from the oven, split each one open, lay a pat of butter inside, and pour a ribbon of dark cane syrup over the top. That was the whole breakfast some mornings, just biscuits and syrup. The Alaga brand was so popular in black households that the company marketed directly to African American communities for decades. A bottle cost about 20 cents in 1955. The syrup was thick, dark, and had a deep sweetness that refined sugar could not match. Children soaked their biscuits until the bread was almost translucent. The syrup pooled on the plate and you used your finger to get the last of it. This was not poverty. This was simple. This was a woman turning flour and sweetness into something her children remembered for the rest of their lives. They were following a memory. Number 23, crackling bread. When a hog was slaughtered, the skin was cut into pieces and rendered until the fat melted and the skin turned into crunchy golden bits called cracklings. Those cracklings went straight into cornbread batter. The result was bread that crackled when you bit into it, rich with pork flavor and studded with crispy morsels. A pan of crackling bread could sit on the counter for 3 days and still taste good. In rural Georgia and the Carolinas, crackling bread with a glass of buttermilk was the traditional breakfast, and it did not need anything else. The cost was nothing because the cracklings were a byproduct of making lard, which was itself a byproduct of the hog already paid for. The hog gave meat for the smokehouse, fat for the lard bucket, and cracklings for the bread. Nothing went to waste because nothing could afford to. She started it before you woke up. You heard the scrape of the spoon against the skillet, the low hiss when the batter hit the fat. The batter was nothing. Cornmeal, water, salt, and whatever grease was saved in the tin beside the stove. You pressed each spoonful flat, and what came off was a crisp-edged corn cake with a soft center. What you ate it with was the sap, molasses, and warm leftover grease stirred together in the skillet after the last cake came off. Black Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama gave that combination its name, gravy and syrup both, costing nothing and wasting nothing. The knowledge of how hot to run the skillet lived in your ears. You knew by the sound, not by a timer, not by a recipe. That knowledge passed by standing next to her on Saturday mornings. When she stopped making them, it stopped being passed. Number 21, fried catfish for breakfast. In the 1950s, if you lived near a river or a creek in the rural South, you did not wait until supper to eat fish. A woman in the Mississippi Delta would take catfish her husband caught that morning, dredge it in seasoned cornmeal, and fry it in a cast iron skillet before the children woke up. Fried fish, grits, and a biscuit. That was a Saturday morning in a black household along the Yazoo River. The fish was free, the cornmeal was cheap, the grease was already in the pan from yesterday. In coastal South Carolina, black families did the same with whiting and croaker. In parts of Louisiana, it was perch. The fish changed with the water, but the method was the same everywhere. Roll it in cornmeal, get the oil hot, and fry it fast. By the time your children smelled it, it was already on the plate. That tradition faded as families moved north during the Great Migration. There were no creeks in Chicago. Number 17, fatback and fried apples. In the mountains of Virginia and the Carolinas, fatback and fried apples was a fall breakfast that cost almost nothing. You sliced fatback thin and fried it until the fat rendered. Then you dropped sliced apples into the same hot grease. The apples sizzled and softened, soaking up the pork flavor and caramelizing. A sprinkle of cinnamon if you had it. The plate was sweet and salty and rich, done in under 10 minutes. Apples cost 15 cents a pound in 1963. Fatback was cheaper because nobody else wanted it. The white strips of pure pork fat were what the butcher sold last, often for pennies because affluent customers had moved on to bacon. Black families and poor Appalachian families bought what was left and turned it into breakfast. Cold cornbread broken into a glass of buttermilk needed no stove, no fire, no preparation beyond a spoon. In North Louisiana, it barely counted as cooking. It was just what you did when the kitchen was cold and the morning hadn't earned more effort than that. You crumbled the cornbread in, poured buttermilk over it until the bread softened and the liquid turned faintly yellow, and ate it standing at the counter. The tang cut through the corn, the bread thickened as it sat, and the whole thing filled you the way only starch and fat can, slowly, completely, without drama. The African American Registry documents this as a recorded morning meal across black Southern households where buttermilk kept without refrigeration and cost pennies a glass. It fed you before a long day in somebody else's kitchen. It has left the table almost entirely now, replaced by things that come in boxes and require considerably more of everything except memory. Number 24, sweet potato and leftover pork. In Tuskegee, Alabama, in the 1950s, a study by the Department of Agriculture found that fat salt pork, cornmeal, and molasses were the staple foods in most black households. So when there was a piece of pork left from supper, it did not get thrown away. A woman in rural Alabama would slice a cold sweet potato from the night before, fry it in the leftover pork grease alongside whatever scrap of meat remained, and serve it with a biscuit. That was breakfast. Sweet potatoes were everywhere in the South. They grew in the small plots that black families kept behind their houses, the same way their ancestors had grown them for generations. The potato was free, the pork was already cooked, the grease was already in the pan. This was not leftovers, this was planning. And it was the kind of breakfast that disappeared when refrigerators got bigger and people started throwing food away. That used to be unthinkable. Number 19, blackstrap molasses milk. A tall glass of cold milk with 2 tablespoons of blackstrap molasses stirred until it turned dark and sweet. Mothers called it a tonic. Grandmothers said it built strong blood. They were not wrong. Blackstrap molasses contains more iron per tablespoon than a serving of spinach. And in communities Where anemia was common and doctor visits rare, a glass every morning was folk medicine that worked. A jar of grandma's molasses cost 35 cents in 1965. Combined with milk at 49 cents a half gallon, 2 weeks of morning drinks for under $1. Children drank it cold in summer, warm in winter. Some mothers added a raw egg and shook it like a milkshake. The taste was dark and mineral, almost like coffee for a child. No one calls it a superfood. No one puts it on a menu. But the iron it delivered kept black children standing in classrooms where they were not always welcome. Salt pork hash started the night before, whether you knew it or not. You left the cold potatoes from supper on the counter, and in the morning, diced them alongside whatever salt pork had been sitting in brine. The fatty, cured cut that cost less than bacon and kept longer than almost anything else in the icebox. You cooked it all in the cast iron skillet, the pork rendering its fat first, the potatoes pressing flat until the underside crisped into something golden, salty, and unrepeatable. Salt pork was a documented weekly ration staple in black households from the era of slavery through the Great Depression. The cut that stretched furthest when cooked against a skillet of potatoes and onion. You knew the hash was done when the kitchen smelled like it was done. There was no timer for that. Nobody makes it anymore, and nobody who didn't grow up with that cast iron skillet will ever quite get the crust right. Number 20, crackling bread. This was cornbread with an attitude. A woman in Greenwood, Mississippi would render pork fatback until the solid pieces of fat turned golden and crunchy. Those crispy bits were called cracklings. She stirred them directly into her cornbread batter, poured the batter into a greased skillet, and baked it until the top was golden brown and the cracklings had melted just enough to leave pockets of salt and smoke inside the bread. This bread had a chew to it that regular cornbread did not. It had weight. It had flavor that came from an animal, not a bottle. The practice of using every part of the hog dated back generations, passed down from a time when black families were given only the parts that nobody else wanted. But those parts became the flavor. In the 1950s, you could find crackling bread on breakfast tables from Alabama to East Texas. By the 1990s, most people had stopped rendering their own fat. The cracklings disappeared. The bread went quiet. Number 24, coffee-soaked bread. A cup of black coffee and a heel of day-old bread. You tore the bread into pieces, dropped them into the coffee, added a spoonful of sugar, and ate it with a spoon-like soup. In the Mississippi Delta, this was called SOP. In parts of Alabama, they called it coffee, bread. The coffee softened the bread into something porridge-like, warm and caffeinated enough to get a person moving back then. A pound of coffee cost 75 cents in 1964. A loaf of bread was 21 cents. Together, a week of breakfast for under $1. Nobody was proud of this recipe, but thousands of elderly black men and women ate this alone in quiet kitchens across the South, and they never told their children because admitting you ate bread soaked in coffee felt like admitting something larger about your life. But before the boxed things arrived, there was crackling bread, cornbread baked with bits of rendered pork skin folded directly into the batter, the same skin cooked down in a cast iron pot until it crisped into small, brown, intensely savory cracklings. You mixed them into cornmeal, water, salt, and soda, baked the whole thing in a heavy skillet, and what came out was dense, rich, and crackling studded, with a bottom crust nobody who grew up eating it ever forgot. Sorghum syrup finished it, and sorghum carried African roots, brought to the American South from West Africa in the early 17th century, where it was called Guinea corn and had been used as a primary sweetener and grain staple for generations before the first enslaved person reached this shore. Crackling bread cost almost nothing when the hog had already been rendered. You used what the butchering left behind. It disappeared when hog rendering days ended and the cracklings went with them. The last woman who made it right held knowledge about cast iron and rendered fat that has never been written down. Number 19, liver and onions. Your grandmother did not eat this because she liked it. She ate it because she knew it was good for you. A woman in Anniston, Alabama would slice calf liver thin, soak it in milk for an hour to pull out the bitterness, then fry it alongside rings of yellow onion in a skillet with bacon grease. She served it for breakfast with grits and a biscuit. In the 1950s, liver was one of the cheapest cuts of meat at the butcher counter. You could buy a pound for 30 cents. Doctors in that era actually recommended liver for pregnant women and growing children because of its high iron content. Your grandmother did not know about iron. She just knew that when her children ate liver in the morning, they did not come home dizzy from the heat in the afternoon. She was a nutritionist before the word existed. And by the 1970s, when people decided that organ meat was not worth eating, they lost the cheapest, most powerful breakfast on the table. That cost them more than they knew. Number 22, sweet potato pone. Not a pie and not a casserole. Something in between with no modern equivalent. You grated raw sweet potatoes until your knuckles ached, mixed the pulp with molasses, buttermilk, cinnamon, and lard, then poured it into a greased pan and baked it low and slow until the top turned dark and caramelized. The texture was dense and chewy, almost like pudding that decided to become bread. Sweet potatoes were the cheapest vegetable in the 1960s South. A bushel cost less than $1 at roadside stands. Grandmothers who grew their own paid nothing. They baked pone in the evening when the oven was already hot from supper, wrapped it in cloth, and set it on the counter for morning. A slice with coffee was a full breakfast, sweet enough to feel like a treat, substantial enough to carry a person through 4 hours of work. Peanut butter spread on a scratch biscuit was a breakfast with 2 layers of history in it. The biscuit, flour, lard, buttermilk, salt, just enough baking powder to raise it, had been on African American morning tables since before the Civil War, shaped by hands that knew the dough by feel, not measurement. The peanut butter carried older roots, tracing back to West African groundnut traditions that arrived in the memories of enslaved people long before the commercial jar existed. By the Depression years, the Bureau of Home Economics was promoting peanut butter as a protein substitute for meat-struggling families could no longer afford, and in Black households that had been stretching protein for generations, it needed no advertisement. A jar cost a few cents and lasted the week. 2 biscuits spread thick held a person through the morning without complaint. The biscuits were made in a batch on Sunday and eaten through Wednesday. Nobody from those kitchens ever needed to be told what to do with the stale biscuit. Number 23, tomato gravy over biscuits. If you grew up in the Deep South, you know that gravy did not always come from meat. A woman in rural Georgia in the early 1950s would fry a little bacon, pull it from the pan, then add flour and a can of stewed tomatoes to the drippings. She stirred it over heat until it thickened into a reddish gravy that she poured over split biscuits. This was one of those breakfasts that existed because of what a family did not have. If there was no sausage, no ham, no eggs, there was almost always a can of tomatoes and a little flour. The gravy had a tang to it, a slight sweetness from the tomatoes that made the biscuits taste like something more than bread. In parts of Mississippi, they called it red gravy. In parts of Florida, they called it poor man's gravy. Your grandmother probably did not call it anything. She just made it and set it on the table. That was enough. Share this list with the people at your own Sunday table. the ones who still remember which grandmother made the biscuits and which uncle finished the gravy. These breakfasts were never about being cheap. They were about feeding a household through a hard week without losing the warmth that made the kitchen feel like home. Pick one this Saturday, soak the herring, set out the cornmeal, or grind the sausage the way your people did it. Then pour the coffee strong and let somebody younger watch how it is done. The breakfasts we walk through are not lost. They are waiting in our hands and in the patience our elders left behind.